This is Greg Troutwine with Offshore Engineer TV, and we're here in Houston at the OTC, and we're very pleased to be joined again by Matt Tremblay, the Senior Vice President, Global Offshore for the American Bureau of Shipping. Let's just start with the very generic here. Obviously, we're here in Houston at the OTC, the oil and gas business globally. And I know that's a very big frame to start with, but where do you see opportunity? What's going on, and where do you see specific opportunity today?
Well, there's a lot going on, and you're right. It's a big business, but it's a small family, right? We all kind of know each other, and we're all talking to each other all the time. Right now the business is very busy, very successful. There's a lot of new project opportunity. There's a lot of projects that are currently in the pipeline for new work. Um, as you would expect, a lot of the new project activity, probably 50% of it's coming out of South America right now, between Brazil and Guyana. But in general, the industry is moving as fast as it can, but we're starting to get to a point where the supply chain challenges are really starting to almost limit the capacity of project execution. What we're seeing these days is that the capability of the vendors and the vendors of the vendors to meet the project demand is very challenged, and we're starting to see lead times on major equipment that is well in excess of what we're used to seeing. So 40 months, 50 months, 60 months for some of the big, rotating machinery. It really does challenge when you're trying to create a project plan and trying to make a $4 billion investment, thinking forward about a plan that's going to take 5 years to execute. It's both challenging and it's an interesting opportunity for a lot of people these days.
Matt, it's always good to get that big overview, but again, I'd like to dive into a topic that I know you're well versed in, and that's the digitization of the industry. So when someone says what's happening with digitization in the offshore energy space, what do you tell them?
What we see as the greatest opportunity for digitization of what we're doing today, from my perspective, outside of design, is really around maintenance. I started working in this industry a little while ago, back when we were still using blue drawings and 3-ring binders. And today we're using big databases and online tools to really manage our design information and our maintenance information. So one of the big areas that ABS as a class society is involved with is the digitization of what we call asset integrity management. The maintenance side of how am I managing my machinery? How am I managing my offshore structures? And while the data itself is all the same data we might have had in a 3-ring binder, having it in a computer, having it in a digital format allows me to access it and query it and utilize it a lot more efficiently and a lot faster. Now, what that does is it changes the way that we interact with all that data. And we as class need to find ways to continue to find ways to utilize that data more efficiently. Data that is both generated by class inspections, but also data that's generated offshore by the equipment itself. Can an ABS surveyor who used to have a requirement to put eyeballs and a flashlight on a piece of equipment now see what the condition of that equipment is entirely electronically through the data that equipment is generating? So that's the place where we're spending a lot of time making sure that we are keeping up with the industry and helping maintenance stay as efficient as possible, utilizing the data that we have available to us.
When you look at the maturity of the uptake of modern digitization technologies or applications, are we in the infancy, the adolescence, or adulthood when you look at offshore energy?
I wouldn't say we're in the infancy anymore. I'd say we're in the adolescence. We at least know what we don't know. The infancy, I would say we're still trying to figure out what the problems are. I think we've got a pretty good grasp on what the challenges are today. And the next step is trying to figure out how to get past those challenges. For example, a lot of us have a lot of data, and we all say, but the data is too dirty and inconsistent for me to do anything with. That's only a continuous problem if you don't look forward at trying to manage it. That's one of the places that ABS has spent a lot of time, is how do we look at historical data and clean it up so that we can then gain insights into predictive maintenance, into asset condition management from that old data we have. We've been spending a lot of time over the last few years building natural language processing tools so that we can look at handwritten maintenance records from 15 years ago, ingest and interpret and sort, and then use that as predictive maintenance information moving forward.
When we talk about digital and you talk about remote, can you share with us some of the examples, I guess, of how that's evolving in this offshore energy as well?
Two of many angles you can look at is firstly remote inspection. What inspections can ABS as a class society do without the surveyor physically being on board? Whether that's the utilization of drones, whether that's the utilization of just one of the roustabouts on board with a camera, whether that's the utilization of IT type data that we're getting off of equipment. We're doing more and more at ABS to verify the things that we need to verify remotely. The best thing that we're doing from a safety perspective on that remote front is we're removing people from dangerous situations. Every time a human being climbs into a confined space, that's a risk. For example, a cargo tank offshore. If I can put a drone in that cargo tank instead of a human, that's a win. It may be hard to financially quantify that win, but we as an industry put hundreds of thousands of man hours into people accessing confined spaces that if we can cut that even by a third or in half, it's a huge safety savings. The other side of remote is actually remote control and connectivity. If I'm operating a drilling rig or if I'm operating an FPSO, what aspects of those operations can I do safely and more efficiently from the beach? If I have one guy on the beach looking at 3 different FPSOs worth of topsides, I'm both removing people from an offshore dangerous situation and as well improving the efficiency of my asset, requiring less bed days on board. So one of the things ABS published a few years ago was the ABS Guide for Remote Connectivity. And we have now a new notation where if you're doing remote operations, we're not telling you how to do the remote operations. What we're telling is these are the safety risks you need to consider to make sure that you're managing those risks sufficiently. What happens if the power goes out? What redundancy do I need to build into my fiber optic network? What cybersecurity do I need to have in place to make sure that remote connectivity doesn't get hacked? Those type of things is where ABS's place is in promoting the safety of life, property, and the environment. That digital data is the property. And it's just as important to manage the safety of that as it is the people on the steel offshore.
No, I mean, that brings up the obvious next question is what ABS, you create rules. You create guidance for whichever industry you're serving. So, I mean, when I think about digitalization, where are the rules? Are the rules currently there and set, or where are we in that cycle as well?
The traditional rule cycle has always been reactive.
Mm-hmm.
Something gets broken, somebody gets hurt, we write a new rule to make sure that it doesn't happen again. The hardest thing to legislate or break prescriptive rules for is innovation. Because I don't know how it's going to break yet. I don't know what the failure modes are. And so one of the efforts that ABS has been making over the last 5 years is to revisit the way we write rules. And instead of writing prescriptive standards, write goal-based standards. So instead of saying the exit door has to be red, the rule would say the exit door has to be a distinct color that is distinguishable from a person on board. That's a performance-based standard versus a prescriptive standard. Doing that around innovation, whether that's around digitization, remote technology, is a major effort we've been putting in at ABS to be able to write rules that help us promote safety around innovation.
I cannot have a good digitalization conversation today without talking about artificial intelligence. So can you talk about AI, how ABS is using it, and how you see it might have effect in the field as well?
Sure. I mean, AI, like you said, it's a very similar conversation that we have to the digital twins. You ask someone to define it, and 10 people give you 10 different answers, right? Today, everybody wants AI, and no one can tell you what they want it to do, right? Two of the places that we at ABS are looking at initial applications of AI are around our core business. For example, rules and regulations. One of the things that LLMs are really good at is big buckets of words. ABS has 30,000 pages of rules. As well, on top of that, there are statutory requirements out there. So one of the tools that ABS is in the midst of building is a tool that does natural language interpretation of regulation-based questions. For example, what are the rules for CO2 extinguishing systems in Brazil? That's a really hard question to answer when you got 47 books on your shelf as an engineer. Which books apply? AI is really good at pulling in the required parts from that and giving you a pretty good answer. So that's the type of tool that ABS is looking at building, both for ABS, but also for our members and clients, so they can ask those questions and get a resource like that available to them.
No, that's fantastic. And Matt, as always, I appreciate your time. I really just have one more question. Again, you can't have this digitalization conversation. You can't have the AI conversation without talking about the cyber and the cybersecurity. Why don't you just address the cyber and I guess where you see ABS fitting into that cyber piece of the equation?
Sure. You know, just like any other safety aspect that ABS involves itself in, cyber is just as important. The cybersecurity of your data, of the control of your asset, is something that needs to be managed very closely. And there's two sides to the cybersecurity coin. There's the IT side, the ones and zeros, but then there's the OT side, how your people interact with your systems. You know, ABS is very uniquely positioned on the OT side of cybersecurity because we already know these customers, we already know how they operate their assets, and we can give them really good advice around the OT side of cybersecurity and managing whether it's a tugboat or an oil tanker or an offshore drilling rig. The connectivity that continues to grow continues to create more and more touch points for the internet and more touch points for your people that could allow access to the internet. And ABS is very well positioned. We provide a lot of quality services around the OT side of cybersecurity, both from a writing rules perspective, but as well from a providing consultative advice perspective. You know, just recently, like you mentioned, we made an acquisition. A company called RMC has joined the ABS family, and it's a company that's purely focused on cybersecurity, primarily on the OT side of things. And so bringing that experience into ABS, growing our opportunities to support the industry is where we're looking at how the ABS's place in the cyber conversation will be filled.